100 carriers against 4. When these numbers appeared before the Japanese Navy's senior leadership, no one could speak. This was not a hypothetical war game, but the shocking reality unfolding in 1944 as steel leviathan nests streamed endlessly from American shipyards. Like an inexhaustible production line, pushing the Japanese Empire into an abyss from which there was no return, the machinery of war ground forward without pause. On the morning of November 7, 1943, tropical humidity hung heavy over Truckadall, where the combined fleet headquarters held its operations. Inside the operations room, 57-year-old Admiral Mineichi Koga stood before a massive map of the Pacific Ocean, clutching an intelligence summary. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not from age or infirmity, but from the suffocating nature of the numbers written upon it. This career naval officer had inherited command of the combined fleet after Admiral Yamamoto's death that April, rising through the ranks from battleships and cruisers. Now he faced not an enemy on the battlefield, but a set of cold, suffocating figures that told of an industrial nightmare beyond Japan's capacity to match. His intelligence officer, Commander Nakahara, stood across the table, waiting in silence for his superior's response to the devastating report. Koga spoke slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, saying this report claimed the Americans had launched 11 Essex-class carriers in 18 months. 11 fleet carriers, each displacing over 30,000 tons, a scale of construction that Japan could not begin to replicate with its limited industrial base. Nakahara nodded in confirmation, stating that their agents had verified these launch records through aerial reconnaissance and dockyard worker reports. Koga set down the document and walked slowly to the wall map that covered an entire wall of the Pacific Theater, his footsteps echoing in the silent room. Blue markers showed Japanese-controlled territory, still vast despite losses at Guadalcanal and the Aleutians, while red markers showed American positions creeping westward. But what dominated his thoughts entirely was the carrier count, the single most important metric that would determine the war's outcome at sea. In November 1943, Japan possessed 6 operational fleet carriers, while America already had 14, with more completing construction every month. This numerical imbalance was severe enough, but what troubled Koga more deeply was the production rate itself, the speed at which new carriers emerged from American yards. Japan's largest shipyards required 18 to 24 months to construct one fleet carrier, while the Americans seemed to be completing equal or superior carriers in under 20 months. And this American production cycle was continually shrinking as standardized processes and prefabricated components accelerated construction with each successive vessel. Koga's predecessor, Admiral Yamamoto, had warned about this very problem before his death, speaking not in apocalyptic terms, but with quiet, matter minus of minus fact realism. America's industrial capacity exceeded Japan's by more than 10 to 1 in steel production, 20 to 1 in oil, and even greater margins in machine tools and manufacturing infrastructure. Yamamoto had gambled that Japan could win quickly, achieving decisive victories that would force America to accept an negotiated peace before that industrial advantage could be translated into military dominance. That gamble had failed catastrophically at Midway in June 1942, when 4 Japanese fleet carriers sank in a single day beneath the Pacific waves. Now, 17 months after Midway, the consequences of that failure were becoming undeniable, as the American industrial machine produced carriers at a rate Japan could not match or survive. Koga summoned his senior staff officers, and within 20 minutes, 6 men had gathered in his office to hear the intelligence assessment that would reshape their understanding of the war. Vice Admiral Fukudome, the chief of staff, maintained professional composure, while Captain Noemi's eyes tightened as he read the devastating figures about American carrier construction. When asked if the numbers were accurate, Koga confirmed that multiple independence sources verified the same figures, 14 fleet carriers operational with over 20 expected by mid-1944. Silence filled the room as the officers absorbed the implications, until finally I spoke. arguing that Japanese pilots still maintained a qualitative advantage that could offset American numbers. He pointed out that American pilots had limited combat experience, while Japan's air groups possessed veterans from China, Pearl Harbor, and the Indian Ocean raids who could achieve favorable exchange ratios. This argument had merit in early 1942, when Japanese pilots possessed overwhelming experience advantages, but 17 months of continuous combat had eroded that edge beyond recovery. The veterans who had bombed Pearl Harbor and sunk British carriers in the Indian Ocean were increasingly dead or exhausted, while replacement pilots received abbreviated training due to fuel shortages and instructor scarcity. Meanwhile, American pilot training programs had expanded enormously, with intelligence indicating that American pilots now received over 300 hours of flight training before entering combat. America was producing 2,000 pilots per month compared to Japan's 400, a 5-to-1 ratio that would inevitably erode any remaining qualitative advantage Japanese aviators possessed. Koga looked directly at Oemi and challenged him to do the math, pointing out that even with a 2-to-1 kill ratio, Japan would still lose against the sheer numbers of American aircraft. 15 American fleet carriers carrying approximately 90 aircraft each meant over 1,350 aircraft, while Japan's 6 carriers with 70 aircraft each could field only about 420. Oemi, I started to respond, then stopped as the mathematics refused to lie, and the room fell silent once more under the weight of numbers that admitted no argument. Fukudome spoke carefully, suggesting that the Americans could not concentrate 15 carriers in a single battle because their operational commitments were spread across the oceans. Koga acknowledged this was true for now, but warned that as American carrier numbers continued to grow, concentrating 15 or more carriers would become possible, even while maintaining Atlantic deployments. By the end of 1944, they would have enough carriers to maintain Atlantic deployments while concentrating over 20 in the Pacific, making the numerical gap insurmountable regardless of pilot quality. Koga demanded a comprehensive assessment based on realistic analysis, not optimistic estimates or wishful thinking, requiring the true scale of American carrier construction and its strategic implications. The meeting ended in a heavy atmosphere, as each officer departed understanding that they faced a problem no tactical adjustment could solve, a fundamental disparity of industrial power between civilizations. On January 19, 1944, Captain Noemi, I sat in his quarters aboard the cruiser Atago, reviewing reconnaissance photographs that had arrived via submarine from an intelligence agent in America. The photographs, taken at considerable risk by a Japanese operative before his arrest, showed the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia, where 3 Essex-class carriers sat in various stages of construction. Cranes towered over the construction site as thousands of workers swarmed across scaffolding and deck plates, a scale of activity that left Oemi stunned as he compared it to Japanese shipyards. He had visited Kure, Yosakusa, and Sasebo, the empire's premier naval construction facilities, where yards could build only 1 fleet carrier at a time, devoting essentially their entire capacity to that single vessel. The photograph showed an American yard building 3 carriers simultaneously, and intelligence reports indicated this was just one of 6 yards engaged in similar work across the United States. Using a magnifying glass, Oemi, I studied the 3 hulls in their different construction phases, one nearly complete, another at 60%, and a third in early stages with only the lower hull visible. This staggered construction suggested a systematic production schedule, whereas one carrier neared completion, another entered middle stage, and a third was just beginning, allowing continuous work without interruption. Oemi, I drafted a technical assessment noting that the Americans had clearly standardized their construction process, using prefabricated sections assembled in sequence, a fundamentally different approach from Japanese methods. The American approach was perhaps less refined, but vastly faster, allowing the use of semi-minus, skilled labor supervised by a smaller core of experienced workers, a method Japan could not adopt. Japan could not adopt this methodology even if it wanted to, as the infrastructure simply did not exist. The machine tools, fabrication facilities, trained supervisors, and systematic engineering required for modular construction were all absent or severely insufficient. In February 1944, Koga traveled to Tokyo to brief the Naval General Staff on fleet readiness and strategic planning, carrying with him the full weight of the intelligence he had gathered. Senior admirals filled the conference room, the atmosphere formal and tense, as everyone knew the strategic situation was deteriorating, but no one wanted to be the first to say it aloud. Koga stood before the map, presenting the facts one by one: American carrier construction speed, pilot training scale, and industrial capacity disparity, each number landing like a hammer blow. When he displayed the projected figures for the end of 1944, the air in the room seemed to freeze, as 32 American fleet carriers versus Japan's 7 told a story everyone understood. The meeting lasted for hours, circling around the same problems without reaching meaningful solutions, as the officers returned repeatedly to questions that had no satisfactory answers. When the meeting finally concluded, Koga returned to his temporary quarters in Tokyo, exhausted and frustrated, only to receive an unexpected visit from his chief of staff that same evening. Fukudome handed Koga a decoded radio intercept, American naval communications partially decrypted by Japanese crypt analysts, containing fragmentary but alarming details about carrier deployments. The intercept mentioned SEAV E-16 through SEAV E-21, the American hull designation system for carriers, along with Pacific deployment schedules and March 21st operational status. If Koga's interpretation was correct, the Americans planned to deploy 6 additional carriers to the Pacific by March, bringing their total force in theater to over 20 carriers against Japan's 5. Sustainable capacity was the most terrifying part, as Japan had mobilized its entire economy for war while America outproduced it by factors of 10 or 20 to 1 in most categories. Intelligence estimated the Americans were producing Liberty ships at a rate of 3 per day, while Japan's merchant fleet was being systematically destroyed by American submarines faster than replacements could be built. The industrial disparity extended across every category of war production: aircraft, tanks, trucks, artillery, ammunition, and fuel, as America operated at a scale Japan could not comprehend, let alone match. In March 1944, the intelligence intercept proved accurate when American carriers struck Palo with 9 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, launching over 450 aircraft in coordinated strikes. Japanese air defenses, caught by surprise, were overwhelmed as over 100 aircraft were destroyed on the ground or shot down attempting to intercept, while 2 destroyers and 3 transports sank in the harbor. Shore installations were heavily damaged, while the Americans lost only 25 aircraft and not a single carrier was hit, a ratio of loss that told the entire story of the Pacific War's trajectory. Admiral Koga's headquarters was at Palo, and he was forced to evacuate during the air raid, witnessing firsthand the overwhelming strike power of American carrier aviation that his intelligence had predicted. Weeks later, Koga's plane disappeared over the Philippines during a storm, and the combined fleet lost another commander-in-chief, the second in less than a year to die while traveling between headquarters. Replacing Koga was Admiral Soemu Toyoda, an experienced naval officer who inherited a strategic situation that was accelerating toward collapse, with American carrier power growing month by month. In June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea erupted, later dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, marking the end of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. 9 Japanese carriers versus 15 American carriers seemed on the surface to offer a fighting chance, but the truth behind the numbers was far more devastating than appearances suggested. Vice Admiral Ozawa commanded the mobile fleet, throwing everything into the attack as the first wave of 42 aircraft launched, only 7 of which would return from the devastating engagement. The second wave launched over 100 aircraft, only 31 returned, and the third wave was nearly annihilated, as over 300 aircraft were shot down in a single day of one-sided combat. A surviving squadron leader described the desperate situation, reporting that enemy fighter strength was overwhelming and impossible to count, with Hellcats everywhere in every direction. He estimated at least 400 enemy fighters were airborne simultaneously and recommended no further strikes, stating that they could not penetrate such defenses, a judgment that sealed the fate of the mobile fleet. 400 fighters airborne simultaneously revealed the true scale of American carrier power, requiring multiple carriers, precise coordination, advanced radar, and the industrial capacity to produce and maintain such numbers. American losses totaled 30 aircraft, while the carrier Tahoe was torpedoed by the USS Albacore, aviation fuel vapors accumulating in damaged compartments until a massive explosion 6 hours later sent her to the bottom. Over 1,600 men went down with the Tahoe, and that same afternoon, the USS Kavulot torpedoed and sank the carrier S.H. Okaku, another Pearl Harbor veteran gone in minutes. By nightfall on June 19th, Ozawa had lost to carriers and over 300 aircraft, while he had sunk no American ships and damaged no American carriers, a ratio of loss that defied comprehension. That night, Ozawa drafted a message to Admiral Toyoda, brutally honest in ways Japanese military communications rarely were, describing the catastrophic engagement and recommending withdrawal to conserve remaining forces. The message stated that enemy carrier strength far exceeded intelligence estimates, with minimum 15 carriers observed, and that enemy fighter defenses were impenetrable, with attack waves destroyed before reaching targets. Two fleet carriers had been sunk by submarines. Current air group strength was reduced to approximately 100 aircraft from 450 at battle commencement, and enemy losses were believed to be minimal. The message recommended withdrawal to conserve remaining forces, stating that further offensive action with current strength would be futile, a conclusion that marked the end of Japan's carrier offensive capability. When the message reached Toyoda at his headquarters in the Philippines, he read it twice and then sat in silence for several minutes, his staff officers waiting, unsure what to say to their commander. Toyoda finally asked how many carriers Ozawa had reported the Americans had, and was told 15 minimum, possibly more, exceeding even Japan's worst projections of 12 to 14. When asked about Japanese losses, the staff officer reported to fleet carriers sunk, over 300 aircraft destroyed, and approximately 100 aircraft remaining across 7 carriers. Japan had started the battle with 9 carriers, and now 7 remained operational, but with air groups so depleted they were effectively useless, requiring months to reconstitute with insufficient trained pilots. Meanwhile, the Americans had 15 carriers in the Marianas, and intelligence indicated at least 8 more carriers operating elsewhere in the Pacific, a total of 23 against 7 depleted Japanese carriers. The ratio had reached 3 to 1 and would only get worse, as every month brought new American carriers into service while Japan struggled to complete even a single additional vessel. In July 1944, a young intelligence lieutenant named Matsuda completed a comprehensive assessment comparing American and Japanese carrier construction, drawing upon months of intelligence gathering and technical analysis. The final document ran 40 pages with detailed appendices, but it was the summary page that captured the essential truth of the carrier construction disparity between the two nations. The American carrier construction assessment showed 19 Essex-class carriers operational in the Pacific, 5 in the Atlantic, 5 in final trials, for under construction, and 8 more in the program. Independence-class-like carriers numbered 9 completed. Midway-class fleet carriers had 3 under construction, and escort carriers of the Casablanca and Commencement Bay classes exceeded 60 hulls completed or building. The Japanese carrier construction assessment showed 7 operational fleet carriers with depleted air groups, and only 3 fleet carriers under construction with projected completion in late 1944 or early 1945. The Americans were completing approximately 2 fleet carriers per month, while Japan was completing approximately 1 every 4 months, a production ratio that guaranteed the gap would only widen with each passing quarter. By December 1944, the Americans would have 32 fleet carriers operational against Japan's 10, assuming no combat losses and all construction proceeding without delay, a ratio of over 3 to 1. This ratio did not account for aircraft quality, pilot training levels, or fuel availability, all areas where American advantages were significant and growing with each passing month of the war. Japanese naval aviation faced an opponent with effectively unlimited industrial capacity relative to Japan's constrained production, making carrier parity impossible under any realistic scenario. The best achievable outcome was maintaining current force ratios while seeking opportunities for tactically favorable engagements, as strategic naval victory was no longer attainable through carrier operations alone. Lieutenant Matsuda submitted his report to his superior, who read it with a grim expression and forwarded it up the chain of command, where it eventually reached Admiral Toyoda, who filed it without comment. In August 1944, American carriers struck the Bohemian Islands, coming within 700 miles of Tokyo, bringing the war directly to Japan's doorstep with overwhelming force. Japanese radar operators tracked the American formations, counting ships with growing disbelief as the numbers climbed higher and higher, reaching a total that seemed impossible. 23 carriers, the operators counted again to be certain, 23 fleet and light carriers operating as a single task force, launching coordinated strikes against Japanese positions. This number exceeded Japan's entire carrier strength at the peak of its power, and this was just one American task force, with intelligence indicating more carriers operating elsewhere in the Pacific. The radar operators' report reached Tokyo within hours, where Navy Minister M. I read it and called an emergency meeting of senior naval staff to confront the impossible question of how to fight such overwhelming force. 23 carriers in a single task force, Yona, I said without preamble, asking if anyone could explain how they were supposed to fight this, a question that hung in the air without answer. Finally, Vice Admiral Ozawa, recently returned from the Philippine Sea disaster, spoke, telling the Navy minister that they could not fight this through conventional means, as the Americans had achieved such numerical superiority that traditional carrier warfare was impossible. The Americans could absorb losses that would be catastrophic for Japan. They could operate continuously while Japanese forces had to husband resources, and they could replace losses in weeks while Japan required months or years. When asked what he recommended, Ozawa chose his words carefully, stating that they must accept the carrier war was lost and preserve remaining carriers for homeland defense, using them only where tactical surprise or strategic gain justified the risk. Attempting to contest American carrier dominance in open battle would simply result in complete destruction, a conclusion that marked the end of an era in Japanese naval strategy that had begun with the triumph at Pearl Harbor. The carrier war was lost, an admission that hung in the air like an invisible blade, severing the last illusions of the Japanese Navy and the strategic doctrine that had guided it since Pearl Harbor. For 3 years, since Pearl Harbor, Japanese strategy had revolved around carrier dominance, with the mobile fleet serving as the nation's sword and shield in the Pacific War. Now the sword was broken and the shield was shattered, and the industrial mathematics that had made this outcome inevitable had finally become undeniable to every officer in the room. From the trembling intelligence summary in the truck operations room to the suffocating silence in the Tokyo conference chamber, every moment told the same story of industrial civilization overwhelming individual courage. From the desperate attacks torn apart by Hellcats over the Philippine Sea to the final admission of defeat in the carrier war, the pattern was clear and inescapable. When the flood of industrial civilization pours forth, individual courage and skill ultimately cannot reverse the direction of history, a truth that the Japanese Navy learned through 3 years of devastating experience. The story of the Pacific Carrier War is ultimately a story of numbers, of steel poured in ships launched, of factories that never slept and shipyards that never stopped, of an industrial colossus that Japan could not comprehend. From the first intelligence reports that revealed the scale of American production, Through the devastating battles that confirmed those reports, to the final admission of defeat, the arithmetic was always the same. The carriers that slid down American shipways at the rate of 2 per month were not merely ships. They were the physical manifestation of a civilization's capacity to transform raw materials into instruments of power on an unprecedented scale. And so the Pacific Carrier War ended not with a decisive battle, but with a quiet admission in a conference room, as the leaders of the Japanese Navy acknowledged that the arithmetic of industrial production had defeated them more thoroughly than any military engagement ever could. If you want more deep dives into history's most devastating strategic miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. I am your strategy observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield, where the lessons of history continue to echo through the decisions of nations and the fate of empires.